What would you do if the quietest person in your house, the shy maid, who had never once asked you for anything in 6 years, simply vanished one Tuesday without a note or a goodbye or a forwarding address, and you spent 11 days telling yourself that people leave jobs? And then you finally went up to her room under the roof and opened a box you had no right to open, and understood what she had actually been doing for you, and sat down on the edge of a narrow bed and wept. He had not cried since he was 19. His own men could never make sense of it afterward, that Ivor Castellan, who had buried a father and a brother without a flicker, was found sitting on the floor of a servant's room with his shoulders shaking and a stack of paper in his hands. This is a story of hidden worth, of a woman so quiet an entire household mistook silence for having nothing to say, and of the ruthless man who discovered, 11 days too late, what she had been carrying alone. Bess Cardew had been a housemaid in that fortress for 6 years, and had spoken, by her own estimate, perhaps 400 sentences in total to anybody in it. She was 29, soft and generously curved, with a round, watchful face and a stammer that came back whenever anybody looked at her directly, which was why she had learned early to make sure nobody did. She had grown up the middle child of a house full of loud people who finished her sentences out of kindness, and had eventually stopped starting them. She was not stupid and not slow and not, whatever the kitchen said, simple. She was a person who had been interrupted for 29 years and had drawn the obvious conclusion. What none of the people who called her the quiet one ever discovered was what Bess did on the roof, because Bess Cardew kept pigeons. Not as a whim. Her grandfather had raised them for 40 years in a colliery town that no longer existed, and had put the first into her hands when she was 6, and she had understood at once that here was a creature that did not require her to speak. She had brought 4 birds when she came at 23, and asked, barely audibly, whether she might use a corner of the roof, and the housekeeper said yes, assuming it was a hobby that would die out in a month. 6 years later, there were 31 in a loft. She had built herself, and she knew everyone by the sound of its wings, and had trained them the old way, so a bird taken 40 miles in a basket would be on that roof in under an hour. Nobody in that house thought about it. The men called them her chickens. And on the Tuesday, everything changed. Bess Cardew fed her birds at 5, put on her coat, walked out of the service gate, and did not come back. Ivor Castellan was the reason rooms had temperatures. He was tall and broad and dressed in charcoal, cut with lethal precision, the head of a family that owned the river freight, and the fear of every serious house for 100 miles, and rumoured to end a life with a single, unhurried nod. He rarely raised his voice, and he had never, in 6 years, had a conversation with his housemaid that ran past 9 words, which was not, he would come to understand, because she had nothing to say. He noticed she had gone on the second day, which surprised him. The tea came at the wrong strength, the fire was laid differently, and a window was shut that had been open every morning for 6 years. And he found himself standing in a corridor at 11 at night, working out what was wrong with his own house. He asked the housekeeper, who said Bess had left without notice and without a word, in the tone people use for a girl who has run off with somebody. And Ivor Castellan said quietly, "Did anybody ask her why?" Nobody had. He told himself for 11 days that people leave jobs, and on the 11th day, for reasons he could never explain, he went up 4 flights, and along the passage, under the roof, and opened the door of a room he had never entered. It was very small and very clean, the bed made, and on the shelf, beside a photograph of an old man holding a pigeon, was a wooden box with a brass catch, and Ivor Castellan, who had no right to it, opened it. There were 41 pieces of paper inside, all in the same hand, all short, the first dated 8 months earlier. It said she should think carefully about the fact that a girl with no family in this city can disappear without anybody making a fuss. The second, 3 weeks later, named her sister's street. The 11th held a photograph of Bess buying bread. And halfway through the stack, the letters stopped being about her and started being about him. And the last, dated 4 days before she left, said Ivor Castellan would be dead inside a month unless the maid on the top floor took her birds and her bag and went without a word, because a maid who says goodbye is a maid who explains, and a maid who explains is a corpse, and so is the man she explains to. He sat down on the edge of a narrow bed, and that was where Joseph, his second, found him later, holding 8 months of letters a woman had received, alone at the top of his house, endured in silence, and never brought to him, because bringing them was the one thing she had been told would kill him. It took 9 days to find her, and she had done it properly, which broke something in him again, because it meant she had understood exactly how a person disappears from men like him and had planned it alone. She had gone to a town 4 hours north, taken a room over a shop under another name and work in a laundry, and taken all 31 birds because she would not leave them, and because a woman with a wicker basket on a train is going to a poultry market and nobody looks twice. They found her because of the birds. Ivor Castellan drove up alone and stood in the yard behind a shop, and Bess Cardew came down the outside stair with a feed scoop in her hand and stopped dead. He said, "I opened your box. I had no right to." And Bess, who had not spoken to a living soul about any of it in 8 months, said nothing, and her hands began to shake, and he watched her fight the stammer she had fought since she was 5 and lose. And he did the thing she later called the moment, which was that he did not fill the silence. He waited in a cold yard in his good coat for as long as it took, and when she finally got the sentence out, which was, "I did not know what else to do," he said quietly, "You did the bravest thing I have ever heard of, and I am ashamed that it was necessary." He asked her to come back. She said no clearly, and he did not argue. What he did instead was sit on an upturned crate in a laundry yard in a £5,000 coat and say he was not going to move her, that she could tell him about the letters at whatever speed she liked, and that they had all day, and if necessary, all week. It took 4 hours, and in them Ivor Castellan learned more about his own house than in 11 years of running it, because Bess Cardew had not simply endured. She had been thinking. She told him the first letters came by post, and the later ones did not, that 6 had appeared inside the house on her bed, at the top of 4 flights only, staff-used. She told him whoever wrote them knew things about the household diary no outsider could know. And she told him, barely above a whisper and without one hesitation, because it was the part she had rehearsed 1,000 times alone, that 3 times the letters had referred to plans made in his own study, each discussed in a room where only 4 people were present. She could not prove it and had nobody to tell. She had done the only thing a frightened woman with no power can do, and kept every letter in order, with the date and place written on the back in pencil. Ivor Castellan looked at a laundry yard and understood that his housemaid had built him a case. She came back in the spring, and not as a maid. That was her condition, made herself, stammering twice, in the middle of that yard, and it was the first thing she had ever demanded of anybody in her life. A wage, a door that locked her birds on the south roof where the light was better, and no room at the top of 4 flights. Ivor Castellan agreed to all of it in 4 seconds, and Bess began to unfold. It happened slowly, and mostly because of one thing, which was that he never once finished her sentences, not in 6 months. He would ask her something and wait in a way that visibly unsettled his own men, and she would get there and the stammer began to loosen. She started speaking at dinner. Every evening they ended up in his study over a decanter of amber brandy. He poured for himself and a pot of tea she made properly, and he told her about the father and the brother and the trust he had buried with them, things he had said to nobody. He learned she flinched at raised voices and read a room the way she read weather. And one evening at the study door, his hand rose to cradle her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheek, and he said, "Tell me to stop." And Bess, who had spent 29 years being interrupted, took her time and said no, and he murmured good night into her hair, "Draga Mea," and stood in the corridor afterward, like a man who had been struck. But Bess, being Bess, had gone on thinking about 6 letters that had appeared inside a locked house, and it would not let her rest. The cruelty came at a formal dinner, and it arrived beautifully spoken. Adrienne Sallow had spent 2 years positioning herself to become the next Dumna Castellan, and had returned from a long absence to find a former housemaid at the table, and waited until the room was quiet before crossing to Bess by the windows with an audience assembling. "Oh, the maid," Adrienne said brightly, loud enough to Carrie, letting her eyes travel over Bess's body with theatrical sympathy. "Sorry, I am told we do not say that anymore." She smiled like a blade. "May I be honest, since nobody else will be. He is a man who feels responsible for you, and responsibility is a warm feeling that people mistake for other things all the time. But you cannot hold a room, and you know you cannot, and when he needs a woman who can stand at the front of one, you will be back on the top floor. Nobody, and I do mean nobody, looks at a fat girl who cannot finish a sentence and sees the mistress of this house. The temperature by those windows dropped 20 degrees. And the old Bess would have said nothing at all, because that was what she always did, and everybody in that room, including Adrienne, was entirely certain that this was what would happen now. But something had been rebuilt in her, and she did not lower her eyes, and she took her time, which unnerved the whole room, standing in the silence for 4 full seconds before she spoke. "You are right that I cannot always finish a sentence," Bess said, quiet and completely steady, "which means I have spent 6 years in this house being spoken over by people who were sure I was not really listening. She let that sit, and nobody filled it. So I listened, Adrienne, for 6 years. And I know that in the 8 months I was being sent letters. 6 appeared inside this house on the top floor, which only staff use, on days when the household diary had this family out and 11 visitors in. I kept the dates. So be careful who in this room you think was not paying attention." The silence had teeth. Adrienne Sallow went the colour of the tablecloth, and Ivor Castellan, who had crossed the floor without hurrying, took Bess's hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles before the whole table and said, "This woman kept 8 months of threats to herself to keep me alive. You will not make her small in this house again. Draga Mea." But past Adrienne's shoulder, a man who had stood at the Castellan family's right hand for 14 years had gone very still because the maid everybody called Simple had just said out loud that she had kept the dates. The man was Merrick, Ivor Castellan's most trusted man since before Ivor took the family, and he had spent 2 years arranging its sale to a rival house. His problem was not the plan, which was excellent. It was that 11 months earlier, a housemaid had been laying a fire in the study when he came in to speak to Ivor, and he had not noticed her for 11 minutes, and when he did, he felt a cold drop in his stomach he never got over. But careful men do not leave a witness in a house, and he could not have her killed inside those walls, without questions, so he did the elegant thing. He frightened her out. 8 months of letters, escalating, patient, the last aimed not at her fear for herself, which he correctly judged insufficient, but at her fear for the man she made tea for. And it worked. She went silently, in the one manner that guaranteed nobody would look for her. And then Ivor Castellan opened a box in a servant's room, went north, and sat on a crate in a laundry yard for 4 hours. Merrick smiled, thin and cold, and began, very quietly, to plan. It was the last mistake he would ever make as a free man. Bess brought it to Ivor that night, in her own time, in her own voice, with 41 letters laid out on the study table in order. She said she had never worked out who, but had always been able to work out when, and that when was enough. The 6 letters left inside the house came on days she could name, and on every one the household had been out, and visitors in the building, and the top floor could be reached without passing the front hall by exactly one route, the back stair from the study corridor. She had cleaned that stair for 6 years. Nobody used it but staff and one other person, because it came out beside the study door, and precisely one man in that household habitually left the study that way because he disliked walking back through the hall. And then she said the thing that finished it. The letter that named the plan had come on a Thursday in October. The plan had been discussed on the Wednesday evening in the study while she was laying the fire. There had been 4 men present, and Merrick had looked at her twice. She laid it out without drama, in order. 41 dates, 6 intrusions, 1 stare, 4 men, 2 looks. And Ivor Castellan went very still and then did the thing that undid her completely. He believed her instantly. He did not ask twice, and did not ask whether she was certain, and afterward she understood this was the point, that a man who had let his own house call her simple for 6 years would never fail to take her seriously again. "Merrick," he said quietly. "Yes," said Bess. Then he took her face in his hands and said, "If I move on him, and he sees it coming, he will not come at me. He will come at you, because you are the only thing on earth connecting him to those letters," and neither of them knew that Merrick had already made that decision. The house went dark at 2:30. Bess was awake because she had not slept properly since the letters began and had stopped expecting to, and the power died and took the lights and the yard lamps and the telephones with it, and every instinct 8 months of being hunted had honed screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. Ivor had been drawn out at midnight to a meeting she now understood was a fabrication. And Bess Cardew, sitting up in the dark in a room with a door that locked, knew with terrible certainty that they had come while he was away and that they had come for her, and for 41 pieces of paper. She did not scream. She did not faint. She did not run. She thought cold and clear, the way she had thought every night for 8 months in a room at the top of 4 flights. Somewhere below, a door came off its hinges, and Bess Cardew did the thing no one in that house, friend or enemy, had thought to account for, because every man in that building had spent 6 years calling her birds, her chickens. There were no telephones. The lines were cut, the signal in that valley had never been worth anything, and the power was gone, and every man coming up those stairs knew it, because that was the point of coming at 2:30. What none of them knew was that on the south roof were 31 racing pigeons flown from that loft twice a day for 6 years, and that 4 had been taken in a basket 11 times in the previous 3 months to a stone cottage 40 miles away, belonging to Ivor Castellan's oldest ally. Because Bess Cardew had spent 3 months quietly training a route that existed on no map and could not be cut, jammed, intercepted or switched off. She had written the message weeks before and kept it rolled in a canister in her pocket, because a woman threatened for 8 months' plans for the night it stops being letters. She went up the loft stair in the dark, opened the hatch, took the 2 strongest birds off the perch by feel, and sent them one after the other into a black sky at 2:30, which is not a thing you can do with an untrained bird, and is barely a thing you can do with a trained one. And then she closed the hatch and sat down in the dark on the floor of a loft that smelled of grain and feathers, with the rest of them shifting and murmuring around her, and waited. She heard them go through the house below, heard them find her room, heard a wooden box being opened, and a man swear when he found it empty, because the 41 letters had been in the study safe since the night she laid them out on the table. And then she heard the ladder and the unhurried footsteps of a man coming onto the roof. "Bess," said Merrick, into the dark. "Where are the letters?" he said. 14 years I have been in this family," he said, moving carefully along the leads, "and I have thought about you every day since you laid that fire, and do you know what I keep coming back to? That you never said a word, not one, in 11 months. He stopped near the loft. In the end, I decided it did not matter, because either way, you could do nothing about it. A girl who cannot get a sentence out, cannot stand in front of a room of men and accuse me of anything." And Bess Cardew, sitting on the floor of a pigeon loft in the dark, did the one thing he never expected, because she had never been the harmless thing he took her for. She spoke, and she took her time about it, and did not stammer once. "You are right," she said. "I cannot stand in front of a room of men." Silence. "The letters are in the study safe, and you cannot open it," she said. "There are 41, and every one has the date and place written on the back in pencil, in my hand, going back 8 months, which is 8 months longer than you have had to invent an explanation." She let that sit. "And the telephones are cut, and the power is off, and you are extremely pleased with yourself about that. But 4 birds went from this roof to Anton Ferent's cottage 11 times in the last 3 months, and 2 left 20 minutes ago. And there is nothing to cut, nothing to switch off, and nothing to chase." She paused. "You spent 11 months certain that a woman who cannot speak cannot tell anybody. You never once thought about who else can carry a message." Merrick said nothing at all, which was the closest thing to a confession she would ever get. And in that silence, 40 miles away, an old man in a stone cottage was already in a car, and closer than that the gates below came inward with the tortured shriek of an engine pushed past its limits, because Ivor Castellan had turned around on a dark road 11 minutes earlier, for reasons he could never explain. Time seemed to fracture. Noise erupted below, brief and brutal and absolute, and Merrick turned toward it, and Bess, who had crossed those leads twice a day in every weather for 6 years, was already moving to the far stair, and was through the hatch and down it before he found his footing on lead he had never walked on in his life. And then the roof filled with torchlight and Ivor came up, the ladder soaked to the skin, and Joseph, his loyal second, came behind him with a crowd of men, and the trap Merrick had spent 2 years building closed around him instead, on a roof, in the rain, in front of 31 pigeons. Ivor had him against the parapet by the throat before he could speak. 14 years, he said, almost gently. You wrote to a girl in my house for 8 months and told her I would die if she said one word to me. Then he turned his head, and the murderous cold in his eyes dissolved into raw, naked fear, and he released Merrick to Joseph's men and went down the hatch and found her at the bottom of the stair. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands moving over her arms, her face, her shoulders. "Did he touch you? Look at me. Breathe. Tell me." "I am fine," Bess said. Steady, even now, her fingers curled into his soaked coat. "I sent Cobb and the little blue hen." She took a breath and did not hurry it, and finished the sentence exactly as she meant to. "They will be at Anton's inside the hour, and they have never once missed, which is more than I can say for anybody who works for you." And Ivor Castellan laughed once, wetly into her wet hair, then framed her face in his shaking hands and looked at her the way nobody in her whole overlooked life ever had. "You extraordinary woman," he breathed. "He cut every line into this house, and you had birds, and then his voice cracked open entirely. "Do you know what I understood in that room under the roof?" he said hoarsely. "Not that you were in danger. That you had been in danger for 8 months, in my house, 40 feet above my head, and had decided the safest thing for me was that I never find out, and that you were right." He pressed his forehead to hers. "Nobody has ever protected me before. Draga mia, I did not know it was a thing that happened to people." Merrick, who had smiled at the Castellan family for 14 years while arranging its sale, learned the price of underestimating her before the week was out. Ivor did not act in blind rage. He let Bess lay it before the families herself, standing, in her own voice, at her own speed, in a room of 30 men who had every one of them walked past her in a corridor without seeing her. She read out 41 dates. Nobody interrupted, not once in 40 minutes, and afterward several of them said it was the most uncomfortable 40 minutes of their lives, because the pauses were long, and every man in the room had to sit in them. And when it was done, and the rival house that bought Merrick was exposed with him, Bess did not counsel death. "You do not need to make him a martyr," she said quietly. "You need to make him nothing." So they did it her way. Merrick was stripped of everything and cast out alive, and what followed him was not the treason but the manner of it, because the story went round every family on that river inside a month, and was always told the same way, that Merrick, who was so careful, spent 8 months terrorizing a girl who could not speak, and was caught by her pigeons. He was not destroyed, he was simply, permanently, a joke. And the old men agreed that was considerably worse. And Adrienne Sallow, who had said that nobody looks at a fat girl who cannot finish a sentence and sees the mistress of that house, found her long absence had coincided too neatly with certain dates on the backs of certain letters, spent a very long season explaining a coincidence. And afterward watched from the far end of every table. Bess now sat at the head of. A year later, on a bright morning washed gold with new sun, Bess Cardew stood on the south roof with a bird on her wrist and the valley below her, and she was not the quiet one anymore, though she was still quiet, which is a different thing. She wore rich colors cut to celebrate every curve she had spent 29 years being told to hide. She still stammered sometimes, and nobody in that house ever finished a sentence for her again, because the one time a visiting man tried, the master of the house looked at him in a way that ended the visit. Ivor came up the loft stair and stopped, simply to watch her. "You are staring," she said, without turning round. "I will never stop," he said, crossing the leads to her. "Do you know what I understood that day in the yard?" he said quietly. "Not when you told me about the letters. Before that, when you could not get the first sentence out, and I made myself wait, and it took 2 minutes, and I realized that in 6 years, nobody in my house had ever given you 2 minutes. He lifted her free hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. "Everyone in my world talked over you for 6 years, Dragamea, and you were the only person under my roof who ever risked her life for me. And you did it without saying a word, because you had been taught your words did not matter." Bess looked up at the man that whole river feared, who bowed to nobody, and had wept on the floor of a servant's room, and for the first time in her life she believed she was exactly enough. She had spent 29 years being interrupted until she stopped starting sentences, dismissed by a whole household as the quiet one, the shy one, the simple one, and she had proven every last assumption wrong, because the thing they had all laughed at, the birds on the roof, had turned out to be the only line out of that house nobody could cut. She had left one Tuesday without a note, because a note would have killed him. And by the time his enemy understood what she was, the shy maid they had all spoken past had 8 months of evidence in a safe and 2 birds in a black sky, and the man who had not cried since he was 19 sat on the floor of her empty room holding the proof of what she had done for him. If Bess and Eva's story of hidden worth, silent courage, and a truth found 11 days too late moved you, if something in you broke a little when he opened that box, then do us a small favor before you go. Smash that like button right now. Share this with someone who has spent their life being interrupted by people sure they had nothing to say. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another twist-filled tale of the overlooked soul who finally gets everything she deserves. And drop a comment below and tell us, what was your favorite moment in Bess and Ivor's story? Paul.